Hey there, friends, and welcome to Rewoke, Rewriting Our Kids' Education podcast. I am your host, Michelle Person, and friends, we are on a journey. We are rethinking, re-examining, and re-educating ourselves and our children. Virtual learning has received a lot of attention in the last year and a half. It's almost as if this approach to learning appeared out of thin air. But I can assure you that people have been navigating online learning for almost 2 decades now, far before the concept was shoved into the spotlight 2 years ago at the height of the pandemic. So what is virtual learning? Is it right for your family? We are going to dig into that topic today with our guest, Associate Professor and Adjunct English Instructor at Southern New Hampshire University, Megan Hall. Megan has been working in the virtual space for almost as long as it's been an educational option, and she's going to share with us what she has learned. Former Stanford professor and founder of Coursera, a popular online education platform, Daphne Kohler said that education can serve 2 goals. For students lucky enough to have access to great teachers, blended learning can mean even better outcomes at a lower cost. And for the millions here and abroad who lack access to good in-person education, online learning can open doors that would otherwise remain closed. Is virtual learning the platform of the future? Or is it too problematic to ever impact students in a positive way? And oh yeah, are you woke? Hi, Megan. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to talk about this.
Yes. So before we dive deep into the conversation about virtual schools and classrooms, can you give our audience a little bit of background about how you came to be kind of an expert on this topic?
Absolutely. So, when I first got out of school, I actually started in working in pre-K, and I taught preschool, and I did the before and after school and summer like enrichment programs.
Mm-hmm.
And then at a certain point, I was like, I got to work with older students. So I went back to school, got my graduate degree, and I've been a college professor for 15 years. And I've been teaching online for about 9 or 10 years, so long before COVID.
Right.
Which is kind of when the uptick in interest in it exploded. But I basically got started because at the time, not now, but at the time, I was kind of one of the younger professors at my school, and I just felt much more comfortable with technology. I had taken some online courses, and so my school had some training and took the training and got certified to teach online and all of that kind of stuff, and now everybody's teaching online.
So funny to say that, because I remember, so my journey to the online, first of all, I want parents to understand that online learning has been around for years. At minimum, I would venture to say, I remember when I came out of undergrad, and I knew a friend of mine, and I'm like, I did a program called Teach for America. Teach for America was a program where you did not go to school to be a teacher. You agreed to do a couple years in a under-resourced school, and you have to take classes to learn how to be a teacher while you're teaching, so that you can adequately service your population and get your license and all of that. And I remember a friend of mine who was in that program with me simultaneously was getting her master's degree. And I remember saying to her, how in the world are you doing it? Where do you find the time? How are you going to class 3 days a week? And she's like, well, it's online. I'm like, what do you mean it's online? She's like I go to class when I can fit it in. Like, it's like I just log in. And I'm like, online? Like, who's going to get an online degree? This was back in 2000. So I'm like, oh, nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to respect that piece of paper. Yeah, fast forward 20 some odd years. I also have a degree from an online institution in my master's, which allowed me to become a principal, that I did a very good job with my online degree for many years. And I did everything online in virtual classrooms. And so I just want parents to understand that yes, for most of our elementary age parents and our high school age kids, the onslaught of online education, virtual education, came because of COVID. We all got a crash course in virtual classrooms. When the school shut down. But I need people to understand that this is not a new phenomenon, and it's been going on successfully for a very long time. So why don't you, to go from right off of that, tell us exactly what a virtual classroom is in your experience and what you've done. What is a virtual classroom?
Yeah, it's interesting because there are a lot of different types. I'll kind of break those down, but essentially it's any learning environment where all or part of the learning takes place in a virtual space.
Mm-hmm.
So for what you were talking about as you were speaking, Michelle, I was like, yes, so one of my first online courses was a synchronous course in my undergrad years where we went into the classroom, but we had a screen in front of us and the professor was at a different college.
Oh, wow.
And then all of our assignments were online. So that there are things like that, that have been going on for a long time. But typically for most schools, we use what's called a learning management system. So that's an LMS. Mm-hmm. And that's where the course is kind of housed online. So think about like a website, but private, that you can only get to by entering, your information and that kind of thing. And they're typically structured the same way. They have, a homepage for each class that you're enrolled in. And they have places where you can have, online discussions, online assignments, that kind of thing. But there are, even within that, a number of different types. So synchronous classes meet in real time.
Okay.
So kind of like we're doing now. Some of them use something like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. Some of them have a thing kind of built right into the learning management system where the instructor can see and talk to the students. So even though they're not in the same space, they're all able to interact in real time. Then we have asynchronous courses, and those are probably the ones that you took and the ones that I took for the most part. Those are not in real time, so all of the materials are up online. The professor might, or the teacher might have office hours where they can be contacted, but for the most part, the student is doing the work on their own according to their own kind of personal schedule. Mm-hmm. And then what's really interesting to me too is that we also have informal virtual classrooms as well. So these are kind of outside the school system. And what I've found is a lot of parents who homeschool use these situations for like enrichment purposes or tutoring. So it's things like Udemy, Teachable, Skillshare, YouTube even, and then and then there are things that are called MOOCs, which are massive open online courses, and those are offered through places like Coursera, where you can enroll and do the work asynchronously and earn like a certificate. Can enroll and earn things like a certificate, or you can just, as an adult or typically like a high school kid, you can just go into that class if it's something you're interested in. So I know kids who do things like photography, graphic art design, things like that. Yeah.
So there's basically a ton of options. And it's funny, like I did asynchronous, and my daughter is actually taking, as part of her high school experience, she takes some college courses, right now, and she's been doing them primarily online. And I remember what I have noticed personally myself is a rise in the synchronous learning as opposed to the asynchronous. So it was just a funny story. Like she was upstairs one day, and I'm like, calling her, because she was like, I'm working. She like, she was like, I'm working, Mom. She basically said, Mom, after I finish the dishes, I'm going to go to work on my classwork or whatever. And I'm like, fine, whatever. To me, that meant you're about to go to log in, discussion board, write a post, whatever. So of course, I go upstairs thinking that's what she's doing, and I like burst into her room, and I'm like, hey, the dishes, blah, 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 blah. And she's like, Mom, she's like, I told you I was about to go to class. I'm like, okay, so like all you're doing is, she's like, Mom. And she turns the computer around and I'm like, oops. Like, I'm like, I'm sorry, like, so like she was literally in a class. Because in my mind, online learning meant you just logged in and you read some stuff and you typed some stuff, and now, yeah, that's not exactly how it always works. So yeah, there are lots of different options, and I definitely made a fool out of myself, and I was very embarrassed in front of her whole class because they were there online with her.
No, don't feel embarrassed. I will say too, a lot of students are confused about, which type they're even enrolled in sometimes. And we also, a lot of schools have hybrid classes as well. Sometimes those are part synchronous and part asynchronous. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the hybrid courses are part online and part in person. So the nice thing is that there's a lot of options, but navigating and figuring out which option is right for you, that can kind of be the difficult piece.
And it's so funny that you say that, because my next question was about, like, there are parents who swear by virtual learning. They've tried it, they love it, and there are parents who are like, oh, this was not for us. And so I guess my next question is, what are some limitations of the virtual classroom, and how can parents who, if we ever, God, please help us know, have to do a situation where it's not an option, or for whatever reason your child is in a situation where they have to do virtual learning, what are the limitations, and how can parents try to address some of those limitations so that their child can still be successful?
Yeah, that's a great question. My number one, my biggest warning, this is my number one tip, is from a teacher's standpoint and looking at things like pedagogically, I think that the programs that are 100% synchronous, and there are, I won't name them, but they're usually for K to 12 students, like kindergarten through high school. If they're 100% synchronous, it really causes a lot of problems from what I've seen, because, a lot of us during COVID got Zoom fatigue because we had meeting after meeting after meeting. Now, I did it because I teach. So I had some like this and some asynchronous, and I missed the in-person, but for me it wasn't. But my husband would be like exhausted, and that's just 3 hours of meetings. But I don't think it's best practices to sit a kid in front of a computer for 8 hours. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that a lot of those programs, parents sign up for them kind of not really realizing that, because they're free, because the program gets money, like school tax money, right? The way that if you were enrolled in public school. But then you have to have what's called equivalent seat time. So they have to be in front of the instructor for an equivalent number of hours. So what I recommend is that if you're going to homeschool, that you, or if you're even looking for like summer tutoring, or, looking into virtual classes, that you think about getting something like a curriculum, or a homeschool co-op. And then you can use the virtual classroom as like an addition. Gotcha. So I know a lot of parents, for example, one of my friends right now has a high schooler where they were doing curriculum with them, and all of that worked really well, except for math. He really needed more help with math, and his mom didn't feel really confident, right? So she enrolled him in a math course. I have another friend who, it's kind of the opposite situation. Her daughter is really far ahead in English and history, so she can take just the virtual classes for those where she's ahead of what the curriculum's giving her. But screen fatigue is a real thing. I think some of the other disadvantages, if you leave in, you could hear my dog in the background. So sometimes distractions like that while you're at home. But the synchronous, if you have a student who's involved in a lot of things, the synchronous could be a disadvantage because it's a set schedule. Mm-hmm. There's on-camera time. When I teach synchronous classes, I talk to students ahead of time about the fact that they have to have really good, stable internet.
Mm.
And if you live in a rural area, you might not have that. I I have some issues with it myself. I'm kind of despite the nerdy decor behind me, I'm in like a farmhouse. So the other thing in terms of like things for parents to know is that sometimes synchronous classes, um, I've seen some behavioral issues in those,
Mm.
meaning like the instructor will break people out into groups. They can't be in every group all at the same time. But is that any different from a regular classroom?
Correct. Correct.
Probably not. Then with asynchronous, some of the disadvantages there are there's less interaction and less direct support from faculty. So if you have a student who is struggling, and they have a teacher who sets up a discussion board but doesn't really participate in it, or they kind of feel like they need the face-to-face time, they're not going to get that kind of support. With hybrid classes, the disadvantage that some of my students say to a hybrid class is that they feel like it's the worst of both. Like there's not enough face-to-face time, there's not enough flexibility, but it really depends on the student, and those the informal that I talked about before, there's really a lack of schedule. So I think those are really better for adult learners or really self-driven high schoolers. Like they're really passionate about a subject, because there are really no interactions in a MOOC class. You have no interactions and it's totally self-directed. So you could take a MOOC and do it in 2 weeks or do it in 12, just depending on how you feel like it.
Yeah.
So yeah. The disadvantages are sometimes the opposite,
Well, that's perfect, because my next question is like, so for all those bad things, for the fact that it synchronous doesn't allow for as much flexibility as you might think, and then the asynchronous doesn't give you that face time, and then there's the issues when you're trying to be synchronous and do a breakout room. The internet connectivity, I can't, like, that was such a real thing for a lot of the families that I worked with. Like, parents were really trying, but your online learning experience is only going to be as good as your internet connection. And like you, for part of my time during the pandemic, I was the principal of a school that was in a rural area. And so some of the kids who lived closer to town had strong internet connections, but some of our families who lived really far out in this town, they were like, I don't know what to do. Like, we don't have the signal. My child is dying to interact, and and it was really, really hard. So those are all real things. But then there are some good things. There are some benefits. So what are some of the benefits of the virtual classroom?
The biggest benefit really is the flexibility of time and location. I've had people who travel for work. I have one student who's a traveling nurse, and she's able to do her homework and her assignments, whatever state she's in, wherever she happens to be. So she doesn't have to be in the brick and mortar building. I actually had a student, and I feel bad because I thought he was kind of making it up. I get some crazy stories from students sometimes, and he said this thing to me. I haven't been in class for the first 2 weeks because I'm training for the Olympics. And I was like, but are you? And it turned out that when I finally got in contact with him, yes, he was actually training for the Olympics. And we switched. I was like, why would you sign up for an in-person class? So we worked to get him switched into the virtual, and then he could just do all of his assignments and keep up in between that crazy, 5-hour
that
day
is
training
so
regimen.
I had a student who was when we went virtual, like she was an ice skater. And her parents had a whole plan, and their goal was to get this baby into their sites were 2028 or 2020, it can't be 2024. I don't know. Whatever it was, they had to, and they went, we lived in Southern Ohio, and they drove this baby every day to Kentucky. Ironically, that's where a great ice skating coaching is, Kentucky.
Yeah.
But they drove this baby every day to Kentucky because their goal is she wanted to try out for the Olympic trials. That was her goal. And being in school, just obviously, like when you have a 2-hour commute there and a 2-hour commute back, and you're doing it 3 days a week, it just didn't work. She had to switch to a different program. So that flexibility is huge. So absolutely.
It really is. A friend of mine, her daughter has a disability, and before COVID, the disability was really keeping her out of school for long periods of time. And they were thinking about homeschooling, but this is a single mom, a very young widow, and they just couldn't figure out a way to do it. And once COVID hit, her school offered some virtual options, and it was so much better for her because she could just be at home and not have, stress sometimes affects disability, and the stress was making her, her things kind of flare up. So it really worked better. Some of the other benefits of the synchronous is that students do get the face-to-face time. So if they want direct instruction, interaction with their peers, that kind of thing, it's a little less writing to keep up with. The asynchronous, people think it'll be easier, but it's a lot of writing a lot of times, and a lot of reading. So if they want the direct instruction, and if that's kind of how they thrive, they can do really well with synchronous classroom. I've seen these work well for younger students or people who struggle with, certain subjects, like I kind of mentioned before. The asynchronous is a lot more flexible. It's really the benefit there too, besides just time, is the ability for people to go at their own pace. So if you have a student who's really proficient in a subject, or they need a little extra time, you can work ahead, or you can work with the instructor to kind of take extra time, or just on your own, you maybe have a week to do an assignment, as opposed to a synchronous where you might have an assignment like every 2 days or every 3 days. So it can kind of work for people. And the informal situations are really useful for extra help. Things like Khan Academy, they have self-paced, open classes for math. The other nice thing about a lot of these virtual classrooms is that there's a real push right now for something called OER, which is Open Educational Resources. A lot of online classrooms will use open educational resources instead of traditional textbooks. So for parents who have college age kids, especially, a lot of times K to 12, we're used to, kids get a book in class, they're given one and they give it back at the end of the year. And many students, when they first come to college, don't know how much textbooks are going to cost. So you can check, because some schools don't have it and some classes don't have it. For instance, like I teach a literature course right now. I'm going to be doing women's memoir. None of those books are still copyrighted. So those they have to buy. But for my introduction to literature class, we're looking at older short stories, poems, plays, so they don't need to buy anything. I have a book that I give them that I've set up together, class materials, right? PDF, and I give it to them for free and that kind of thing. So that's another benefit as well. Yeah, so the free materials as well, if that's something that teachers offer, is another good benefit. So
awesome. Well, do you have any suggestions or tips or resources for parents who are, considering exploring virtual schooling for their little one or medium-sized one?
Yeah, the first thing is to kind of talk to your kid and understand, because some kids really want to do online learning and they really love it and they thrive in that environment. I know a couple kids where I know one who has pretty severe ADHD, and the online learning is he's all about tech, right? He's 12 and all about tech. So he loves being in the virtual classroom and interacting with some of the tools, and some of the courses are gamified and that kind of thing. I've known other students where they do just asynchronous and they feel really isolated. They feel like they're kind of learning on their own. So it kind of depends on how your kid learn. I have one friend who has one of her kids is in online learning and one is not, because that's just just how they liked it. Another tip is to find out about the software. So the hardware and the software, what kind of internet connection do you need? What kind of learning environment do they have? And a good question to ask, and just most schools are set up this way, but just to double check, ask about privacy online and ask about FERPA. FERPA is the Federal Education Right to Privacy Act. Mm-hmm. And some classrooms, right when COVID first hit, were looking for anything, right? To be able to use anything to reach their students. And what ended up happening is that they were using things like Google Docs, but those are not really secure enough under the federal guidelines. So now Google has like workspace for education fundamentals because they've set that up. But things like a MOOC or online classes, some of them might not have those. So if you're worried about privacy, it's just something to kind of think about. Another question is just what works for your family. Do you want something that's more flexible because you're going to be using it as a supplement for homeschool, or you're going to be traveling a lot? Maybe you decided to take a year and travel in an RV. I wouldn't with gas prices, but maybe other people have. Those kind of things. And find out if you want to do everything completely online, or again, just supplement for certain courses. Maybe you have a kid where they've gone beyond math further than what's available at their high school, and they need an online calculus class. Or they already knew Spanish and they want to take an advanced Spanish course or AP chemistry or whatever the class might be. The fourth question is, how much interaction and guidance do you want? Are your kids quick learners, or do they want more guidance? Do they want less? And the last one, and this is kind of like, I guess, the biggest thing. If you've figured out kind of what type of online virtual class you want, and you're looking for like maybe specific teachers or specific programs, I would ask about how they give material, so how they're presenting material, and then how they're giving feedback. Because for me, for example, our learning management system has almost all the materials. I use OER. I give a lot of different types of things. So some journals and some discussion forums, sometimes peer review, quizzes, those kind of things. I have a lot of audio-visual materials, announcements every week to kind of keep them on track, and a lot of feedback, right? So good course design. But I know other people where they've taken an online class and there's like 2 tests, everything is just text-based. It's like a Word document that just has all the instructor's notes. There's a discussion board, but the instructor doesn't participate. My husband just took a class where his assignments were all given a check plus or a check minus. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until the last paper that he actually got feedback from the teacher, and he was so frustrated. Mm-hmm. So I think all of those things are good questions to ask. Those are my tips.
I think that was a lot of information, and I think that for parents who are trying to figure out and navigate, I think you gave them a lot to think about. So Megan, I want to thank you so much for being here with us today and kind of helping us understand like this new world of education, and like whether or not it can work for our kids, and whether or not it's something to consider. It was eye-opening. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me, Michelle. I really appreciate it.
No problem. So to recap, the pros of virtual learning include flexibility and learning tailored to the needs of the students. Some of the cons: rigidity, if you choose a 100% synchronous program, and isolation, if you choose a 100% asynchronous program. Only you and your child can determine which model works for your family. Thank you again to our guest, Megan Hall, and thank you for listening. Show notes and resources to the things we discussed are available on our website, www.justlikemepresents.com. Share this podcast with other parents and educators in your circle, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you liked what you heard, leave us a review. Reviews help others discover our show and begin their woke journey. Have a great week, and remember, if our children can see it, they can achieve it.